Bienvenidas y bienvenidos al webinar El papel de la
Good
sociedad.
morning, everyone, to the webinar of the role of civil society in the provision of affordable housing. During the webinar, we will discuss about management of affordable housing in Europe and in Spain and its key role in ensuring the right to housing. Before telling you some details as to how we're going to organize this session, I would like to explain that this session is organized by Provivienda and funded by the Director General of the UN, International Organizations and Human Rights of the State Secretariat of Global Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation. As you know, we have a great set of experts to discuss this topic today. I would like to thank everyone that has signed up and registered for this webinar, those of you that are connecting now. The truth is that the webinar has been very welcomed in terms of registration figures. We have an audience from all over Spain, but also from Europe. So we'd like to say hello to everyone. With regards to technical remarks, I'd like to explain that throughout the whole webinar, you will have simultaneous interpretation available, English, Spanish, and these could be enabled through the globe icon that you have at the top and right of the Zoom screen. One of the recommendations is that once you click on the desired language, you should then click on this globe icon again and click on silence the original audio so that your experience is better. More things. Well, with regards to the Q&A session, the questions for the discussion should be published on the Q&A icon, which you can find precisely on the toolbar and at the center of the screen, the Zoom screen. You also have the possibility to vote on the most interesting topics so that those questions will appear at the top and they will be preferential. I'd also like to add, before I give the floor to Gemma Gallardo to open the session, I would like to explain that at the end of the webinar, in the coming weeks, Provivienda will disseminate a dossier of practical conclusions, including the presentations and the most highlighted consensus, and we will share these with all the attendees. So, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Gemma Gallardo, General Manager of Provivienda, who will be in charge of opening this session. Good morning, Gemma. Good morning, Arturo, and good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to explain to you that this webinar is part of the project that we are working on from Provivienda Association, which is called the Third Wave for the Right to Housing, the role of the civil society in the provision of affordable housing. And I'd like to thank the Directorate General of the UN, International Organizations and Human Rights of the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs and Global Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation for their support and trust during the development of the project, or when we presented the project from Provivienda. We're actually very happy with the idea of being able to carry on with this project, and particularly this webinar that we're holding today. I'd also like to thank the members of the panels who've been very kind to accept to participate and contribute with their intervention, Clotilde, Juan Francisco, and Karma. And also like to thank all the attendees that have connected to this webinar today for your time. We think it's been very welcomed by everyone. We're really happy about it. This shows the interest in this topic of the right to housing, the different models that are available to provide more affordable housing to the market, and also the trust or the awareness of the social exclusion issue in our country. During this session, we want to propose alternatives for the cooperation and implementation of this situation, and also the role of the civil society, the non-profit organizations as potential support that could help to the model that we currently have in Spain. The right to housing is a fundamental part of the elements that are part of the right to a adequate lifestyle. This is included in the Pact and the Covenant of Social Rights of the UN. It's the right to housing is intimately related to other fundamental rights such as health, education, intimacy, and non-discrimination. And also another right that is fundamental, and that is the right to cities. In the 2030 goals and the SDGs establishes as a target for 2020 the guarantee and the access to everybody to adequate basic accommodation, affordable, and the idea also to improve the marginal neighborhoods. This is quite ambitious, and we haven't got much time left, really. So affordable housing is one of the key challenges in urban areas, but also rural areas these days. And this is a issue that is incorporated at the core of the big programmatic agreements like the Urban Agenda or the Social European Pillar of Human Rights. It is clear that this is a challenge, and this is a target that it is included in all the international agreements and all the programmatic agendas. And this recognizes, and this is very important, it recognizes the role, the social role of that housing plays, and recognizing housing as a fundamental right, and also recognizing the key problem that we have, particularly in some problems like ours. As I was saying, despite it being a fundamental human right, social exclusion, housing exclusion is one of the key social issues that we must challenge, that we must address. It is sad to say that housing exclusion is currently the most important social element explaining social exclusion processes, and it's even more important that the labor exclusion. This is not something to celebrate. It is to recognize the current situation, and that means that we have to put this issue in this right place in our country. The Spanish housing model, which was imposed from the 50s through the creation of homeowners with the increase of protected housing, with the Ministry of Housing at the time, José Luis Arrese had a very intense or important ruling, which means we still have some leftovers of that. And we are now suffering the consequences from them. The processes that we have had for the rating a systematic speculation of protected housing means that somehow we have abandoned the social role of the properties, and we have lost a very important opportunity with this the rating speculation processes that we have seen in our country with protected housing. And we've done it, we have really not used it in the best possible way. Everything we had with the buildings have not been controlled and sustained as they should have been when it comes to protected and subsidized housing. This is a lost opportunity. Carmen Trilla, in one of the studies that she has performed, she has an estimation, she may mention it later on during her intervention, and she estimates what would have happened if we didn't have derated most of the protected housing that was derated in our country. We also have public housing situation. This is part of the public administrations, and we see the key problem that we have. Housing exclusion has moved forward. It has generated new ways of exclusion. The 2008 crisis, the Great Depression, highlighted the vulnerabilities of the Spanish housing system, and it also brought around new ways of housing exclusion, like the occupants by need, like amongst others. Currently, we also have we don't know what the consequences, the social consequences would be of the COVID-19 pandemic. And currently, we're all aware of the other big problem that we're facing, and that is the consequences that we will see with the as a result of the Ukraine war. This is added to the current housing system that we have with very few stakeholders with a specific goals, which is obtaining monetary returns, that this is not going to contribute to the fundamental right to housing. This context, which is quite just given a great overview or a big overview, this is about reflecting of the role of housing associations. This is a model that is very widespread in Europe. That's why we wanted to share with you some other European experiences. And this is a formula that from the non-profit approach, we want to generate affordable housing. Why do we think this model is good for Spain? Well, because we think currently we have social entities that are non-profit type that has the necessary knowledge on this topic. And we also have the necessary structures and the structures that are adapted to the needs to take part as another stakeholder within this housing provision model in the same conditions as other stakeholders, but with different objectives. Which are those objectives going to be? Well, there's going to be objectives by stakeholders like nonprofit organizations in the housing provision system, is that we go away from the cost benefit model and the construction interests. Which are the challenges? And I'll conclude with that. Well, the challenges or the challenge, well, we need to implement urgent proposals and solutions to a recurrent issue. This is becoming worse, this issue, and this is also of a structural type. And like any other structural issue, it requires a different range of solutions. Today, we still haven't articulated legislative counter actions to change this model to access housing, to access and maintaining housing, because it's not just about accessing a dwelling, it's about being able to maintain it in time. We know a lot about that in this country. We believe that our duty should also be the search for alternatives that contribute to end the systemic vulnerabilities of this problem, this structural problem. And we should also increase the rights that guarantee the access to affordable housing of all citizens. This is why we want to widen our view to other solutions that have been implemented in Europe. In this case, we want to focus on the housing associations models or the hybrid management models. The idea here is that we widen our study, our view, our analysis, so that we can extract potential functionalities that could be useful and that we could take into our national Spanish context. The idea is to then be able to implement them so that this right to housing becomes a more real thing in the near future. And with this, I conclude. I hope this session is a session that helps us understand this problem in a better way so that we can see that there are other possible models that they can work in this country in the same way that they work in other European countries. And our goal is also, if we can do it, if this can be done in other countries, why could it not be done in our country as well? So thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoy. Thank you very much, Gemma, for your institutional opening words, and thank you for setting out this framework for this session to be developed. I'd like to remind everyone attending that after the interventions, there will be a Q&A session, and you can already publish your questions to the Q&A icon that you will see at the bottom of the Zoom screen, as we said before. And if you have any technical question, do not hesitate to write to us through the chat, and our colleagues will be very happy to help you. Now, without further ado, we would like to start with the first presentation of this session. We have with us in this study analysis session, we want to talk about the importance of the integration and cooperation of civil society and the administration in the opening of new ways of housing management and their implementation. And in order to do that, we have with us Clotilde Clark-Folquier, Product Manager in Fianza and Coordinator of Housing Solutions Platform. She will be able to tell us about other European experiences where the civil society becomes very relevant in the processes of the housing provision. The idea is to specify the possibilities of the housing solutions models. We want to talk about the advantages and successes in the context and fields where we consider particularly exemplifying. So without further ado, Clotilde, good morning.
Good morning.
The floor
Can
is
you hear
yours.
me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Thank you very much, Arturo. And first, well, thank you very much for inviting me to join this webinar. So, can you see my screen? And can you
Yes,
see
we do.
Can you see the presentation? Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So, so my name is Clotilde, and I work for Fianza. Oops. Okay. I work for Fianza, which is a European Federation of National Organizations working with the homeless. I'm sorry, I'm confused now. My screen sharing is not working, is it? Okay. So Fianza members of Fianza works on a wide range of topics, particularly, of course, linked to homelessness, health, participation, homeless with a migrant background, women homelessness. But Fianza also has developed its work on housing, because if housing is not everything, it is always part of the solution. So that's why we have developed the Housing First Hub, looking at how to promote and develop housing first approach across Europe. My colleague Chloe work on the overview of housing exclusion. So it's every year an analysis of the housing situation in Europe. And my colleague Maria work on the Housing Right Watch, a network across Europe involving mainly lawyers, judges, university professors, looking at the right to housing approach. But myself, I work on the Housing Solutions platform. So Housing Solutions platform, what is it? Well, it's a partnership between Fianza, or a network of homelessness organizations, the Fondation Abbé Pierre in France, which is a foundation specialized in housing for the most vulnerable, and Housing Europe, which is the European network for social and cooperative housing. So we decided to get together to try to better identify, debate, and promote innovative housing solutions for affordable housing in Europe. So that's what I'm working on. So why housing? Well, you know it. In Europe, we have a real housing and homelessness crisis with 700,000 people experiencing homelessness, and actually a situation which is deteriorating year after year. It's been 10 years that homelessness is increasing in almost every country in Europe. And as I said earlier, housing is always part of the solution. So just to illustrate that, I wanted to show you this graph, which shows the stark increase in housing prices, both in terms of ownership and in terms of renting. So just before going on purely the project presentation and the Housing Association part, I wanted to say a word in terms of supply and what is happening in Europe. We also see that in one side, we have a housing crisis where people find it harder and harder to find affordable housing. But on the other side, public investment in affordable housing has also decreased. And the investment gap for affordable housing in Europe is estimated to be about 57 billion per year. So what does it mean? Well, it means that, of course, private investment has become even more crucial, but it also hits some hinders factor. For instance, of course, the high land prices, but also high construction prices. And also the return on investment is low because it is supposed to provide affordable housing. Why am I here today? Well, because the Housing Solutions platform has developed a project recently where we decided to mobilize all our networks and try to identify 50 out-of-the-box housing solutions. So those are absolutely no silver bullets. They respond to local need, and there is not one that is, the solution that should be replicated everywhere in Europe. But we thought it's interesting to highlight those solutions that have been based on grassroots needs, grassroots situation, and are offering one part of a solution to homelessness. So this publication has been translated in Spanish by Red Faciam, I think is the name. So it's available online for free. You can Google it, or you can contact me if you want it. It is divided into 9 chapters, so 50 projects, 9 chapters, highlighting solutions to homelessness carried by social housing provider, focusing on prevention, on activating vacant housing, on innovation in construction and renovation, which is actually more and more of a hot topic at European level with the Green Deal, the independence for energy, also some collaborative housing solution. I really invite you to have a look. I think it's a great basis for inspiration. But so I've been asked to speak about housing association in Europe. What I can tell you, it's not an easy task, because there is no European definition of housing association. There is not one single approach. There is a great diversity of perspective. To the interpretation, if I speak too quickly or if my French accent is too loud, please tell me. So going back to housing association, so housing association per se is really only used in the UK and in Ireland. But generally, what we have when we speak about housing association is a mix of public housing provided by municipalities or local authorities, or limited profit housing provided by private actors who are limited in the way they can operate. There is a diversity of model as well as to the beneficiary they are aiming toward. Some will be aiming toward exclusively lowest income groups. Some will have a much broader scope of action because they want to generate benefits. And so they will also have a big part of middle income groups. Some of them will be focused toward elderly, disabled, it depends. There are different models regarding funding, tenures, and the nature of provider. But there are 2 criteria that we can overall agree on in terms of social rental housing. It's that what is social housing is that it's provided at sub-market prices, and that the allocation is not on a first-come basis, but it's following specific rules decided differently according to countries and authorities. So here I took the OECD definition, but broadly those 2 criteria can be found overall Europe. So according to the OECD definition, you can see a very large variety of social housing approach in different member states. So on the left, you can see countries that have a social housing stock below 2% of their overall housing stock. So this includes Spain, but also many member states from Eastern Europe. And then as you go toward the right, you see countries that have a bigger share of social housing. In Europe today, it's really Austria, Denmark, and Netherlands that are a very significant part of their overall housing stock dedicated to rental social housing. So I've been asked to present some specific projects from the 50 housing solution presentation. So I've highlighted 3, and then I will tell you about others as well, because first I want to start a bit with traditional social housing providers. So this is the Shepherd's Bush Association in West London. So they face a double challenge. First, they have to deal with housing that is often not in a very good state, that need to be regenerated, and they are in one of the most expensive part of Europe in terms of housing. So how have they decided to do that? Well, they have had many projects of regeneration. So I think it's important to say that Shepherd's Bush Housing Association owns and manages more than 5,000 homes in West London. So I'm just going to mention one project, which is in Fulham, where actually the community acquired the school, an old school, but then they didn't have the funding to renovate it. So Shepherd Bush proposed to renovate the school so that they would actually build flats on top of the school. And they used the land value to refurbish as well the ground floor for offices for volunteer group from the community. So they renovated the bottom to have basically rooms that could be used by the community. And on top of it, they managed to set up 20 homes that were made available on the market at affordable price. I think it's important here to say we are not speaking about affordable housing for homeless people at all, because the flats were about 250,000 pounds each. So it's affordable housing for London, but not for the lowest income groups. Maybe just a second example, which is in a way similar because it's also about regenerating an area. So this is taking place in Ireland. It's led by the Irish Council for Social Housing. And I wanted to underline two of their projects because they are particularly targeted population aging and the elderly groups. So for instance, Ford Island, who is a member of the Irish Council for Social Housing, had a project of reconfiguration and regeneration of 5 blocks. And the idea there was really to use those blocks because they were in the community. So they were strategically located close to all necessary services, which was deemed particularly interesting and important for lowest elderly groups. And here the trick, the idea of the project was that the ownership was transferred from public authorities to an NGO, Ford Island, so that the NGO was able to leverage private funding to fund the regeneration plan. And this could have not been possible if it belonged to public authorities. A second project from Ireland, still with the same focus group on elderly people, is Macaulay Place. And what's interesting here, it's a community grassroots project because it was a group of professionals who were aware that they were going to age, and they decided to plan ahead how they could live. And so they set up a community group, and in a bit like in the Shepherd Bush model, organized the new building so that the community would come to them when they would build early. So in this center, you have a community center, there are tea room, a charity shop, art and culture center, and housing for elderly people around it. So that here the idea is really intergenerational solidarity. Okay, so those two were interesting in the sense that they are affordable housing, but affordable housing, I would say, for middle class groups. This one I think is interesting because it's really targeting homeless people. So this is taking place in Denmark. It's run by a coalition of 19 partner organizations involving NGOs, public sector, private sectors. And basically this coalition is called Home for All. And what they did is that they worked with foundations who own student housing and with municipalities. And they convinced foundation to dedicate 10% of their housing to homeless young adults. So why would they do that? Because the homeless young adult who got into this scheme committed to go back to study. And in doing that, the foundation provided them with a student housing, therefore participating to their social inclusion. But further than that, the young people were then able to tap on some specific social scheme for students, enabling them to access housing allowance to pay their rent, but also student allowance of about €700 a month to help them with their living costs. What was very interesting here was also the partnership with the municipality, who agreed to provide the case management based on the housing first approach to support homeless people to tap on the services they need and provide the necessary social work in addition to the housing provided by the foundation. So those were more, I think, what I would call traditional social housing, but I wanted to tell you a bit more about what we would identify as new form of social housing. And I hope it's interesting for you. It's hard, I can't read the room at all, I don't know. But so I would like to tell you about social rental agencies. It's quite developed in Belgium and in France, and it started to develop more in Eastern Europe, but also in the UK. So here is the idea is that you have a rental agency, which is the intermediary between property owner and lowest income group. And the idea here is to mobilize vacant housing, existing vacant housing, because, for instance, in Belgium, 70% of the rental stock belong to private owners. So how can we encourage them to make their dwelling available at a social rent, at an affordable rent? Well, the idea here is to work with the state, who will provide, it depends on the countries as well, but in general, the state will provide tax incentive. The social rental agency will help owners to renovate their home. And most importantly, they commit to the owners that the rent will be paid every month. They take the financial responsibility for that. And in exchange, the owner agree to rent their place at a below market price. So, for instance, in Strasbourg, in France, what happened is that the municipality of Strasbourg decided to carry out a survey to understand why there was vacant housing and how could it be mobilized to be rented at a social rate. And what they saw is that most of the housing in the Strasbourg municipality that was vacant actually belonged to elderly people who either didn't know where to start in terms of administration and management of renovation, or who were scared to rent to some specific social groups. So the municipality worked with them and developed this social rental agency model, guaranteeing the payment of the rent, supporting the owner in the renovation program, so that the owner would agree to put their dwelling to be rented on the market at below market price. This is a bit of a similar model with Neuner IMO in Austria, except here you have a private actor, which is the Erste Bank, who buys the housing and work together with Neuner IMO, which is an NGO, to make sure this housing will then be rented to people who need it most. What is interesting here is that Neuner IMO has also developed a specific model to try to identify and support people who didn't pay the rent before they would be evicted. So what they say is that often social work actually is very intensive at the start, during the first month or two first year when people access housing, but actually eviction generally happen later. So what they said is they try to develop social work on a longer term and have specific criterion to identify risk of eviction, and they try to intervene as early as possible to support people stay in housing. I think that's my last project I wanted to present. It's in Scotland, Scottish Churches Housing Action. Basically, it's churches from all kind of different denominations who got together to develop an office that knows housing association very well, but that also knows churches very well, and that can help them to redevelop their buildings, because their buildings are sometimes not in a very good state, or they are not used as they used to be. So now Scottish Churches Housing Action helps them to, for instance, sell part of the land and then develop on the remaining land a smaller church hall, but that will be energy efficient with some affordable housing units on top, for instance. So I thought that's an interesting for them. And that's it for me for now. I hope it wasn't too long. And please let me know if you have any questions.
Sí, Clotilde, muchas gracias por acercarnos todas esas experiencias europeas.
Thank you very much, Clotilde, for all the information on affordable housing and the different European experiences. This will be very helpful for the Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much for your contributions. And now we're going to move on to give the floor to Juan Francisco Fernandez. He's an architect. He has a master's in sustainable cities and architecture, and he has a PhD in architecture by the University of Seville. He is very knowledgeable of the situation of the Netherlands. And he's going to tell us about that at the role of his experience in the role in the Netherlands for housing provision in the non-profit with a non-profit approach. Good morning, and good morning. Thank you very much for being with us today. Well, first of all, Arturo has already introduced me, but I would simply like to say that I'd like to thank Provivienda for the opportunity to be here today and tell you a little bit about this research, this survey that we've conducted, which comes a little bit from my PhD project. And somehow it gathers my project. We talked about the models of empty housing, and this includes something that was published with the Fundación Alternativas, which is an analysis of the management model of social housing in the Netherlands, and particularly by the model of the housing associations. So I'm going to share my presentation with you. Let's see if I can share the screen. Can you see it? Okay, perfect. Okay, so as I was saying, I have tried in my presentation to include a lot of things, and what I want to try and do is more or less tell a little bit about the different aspects that I consider important. I first want to tell you a little bit about the general context of social housing in Spain and in Europe. First of all, what ideally is that from that context we can understand the model of social housing provision in the Netherlands and the figures of housing associations. Something that I consider quite interesting, and Gemma already mentioned it when she opened the session, is the analysis of the stakeholders taking part in the provision models both in Spain and in the Netherlands, and what roles they take on in order to see what the stakeholders we see in the Netherlands and the Dutch model, and what can we incorporate into our model in Spain, so that we can learn and develop similar experiences within our context. I'd also like to make a quick approach to a specific cases that I analyzed at the time when I performed and conducted this study in the Netherlands. And then I will quickly move on to the general conclusion of the study, and I will suggest a model that I call hybrid management of social housing. And this is a little bit of an approach as to how the Spanish model should be like in order to start looking a little bit like the Dutch model. That would be like a first step of a proposal. So as for the general context, I'd like to highlight a little bit that when we talk about social housing, it is very complicated to talk about social housing in Europe, because the concept of social housing is very different in the different countries, in the different European countries. We could even go to the operational definition given by the European Commission in 2009 of social housing that talks about provision of housing at the supermarket price for individuals in a situation of a disadvantage. If we go to Spain in our context, the concept of social housing is intimately linked to protected or subsidized housing. Subsidized housing in Spain has been a model that during the 80s had quite some weight with respect to the total housing in our country that was promoted in our country. If we look at the graph, VP is subsidized housing, VL is free housing. When we move to the end of the real estate boom, the move between the private housing, private developers and free developments, and compared to subsidized housing, is quite an enormous gap, and protected and subsidized housing is almost testimonial. So protective and subsidized housing in Spain we have talked about two types of housing: the subsidized housing that is used to be sold, and also that is for housing, for rent. We can see here that the promotion in sales or for selling and for rent is an enormous, partly because social housing promoted for rent generates to the administration a set of burden, expenses and complications when it comes to managing and maintaining it. And as a result of that, this is more interesting to promote housing at an affordable price, so that this is being bought by the owners, and that's how we eliminate the problem for the administration. The result of that is that the stock of rental housing in a country that could be compared to social housing in other countries like in the Netherlands, which all the social housing is for rent, the gap is enormous. We see that in Spain, rental social housing in Spain is not even 3%, and in the Netherlands, this percentage is 32%. So just some data, very quick data, because I also like to tell you, I like to talk about affordability when it comes to talk about pricing. The fact that rental social housing in Spain has a very small stock, and because of that, it doesn't work to counteract the price of private housing, so that price becomes also affordable. In Spain, we see that whilst the rental price of social housing is very low, the price of private rentals it triples basically. And there are other countries that have rental social housing at a higher percentage. We see a better balance between the price of free and subsidized housing and rental housing, rental social housing. So there's a competition, and therefore if there's a competition, we need to balance the prices. And the same thing happens here. We talk a little bit about the expenditure in social housing. Here the social housing is very little, very cheap. However, we are at the end in prices in Europe, but we are at the top in prices, in expenses versus the average income. We are at the top with the UK in private rental expenditure. So the private rental market is not at all balanced. In other countries, though, it is a lot more balanced because the social housing works as a counterweight. That said, which I wanted to state, we're going to talk a little bit about the Dutch model. The Dutch model is very strongly linked to the development of policies, the housing policies in Europe developed throughout the 20th century. I mentioned this a little bit because I think it is important. In Europe, after the Industrial Revolution, there was an increase of population in the cities, and that made it necessary to create a social housing stock, a very good, with a lot of dwellings for all those people arriving to the cities, those workers that arrive to the cities and they need housing. At some point, the stock is so high that the state administrations, autonomous administrations don't have a capacity to manage it, and they use, therefore, non-profit organizations, so that they are the ones in charge of managing that stock that has reached such figures that the administration cannot do it. So at a European level, the housing associations, particularly, are different in Spain and in the Netherlands. These are non-profit organizations that initially start managing, but then they promote social housing and they provide social support to the population, to the tenants living in those neighborhoods. And we talk a lot about that hybrid character because these are entities that operate in the public and in the private sector. And lately they have more difficulties in that field because there are some private entities, private stakeholders that claim for the role, and the housing associations are somehow being illegal competition. But what is interesting about that hybrid model is that it allows for a social mix in the neighborhoods, because sometimes the social housing neighborhoods live together with areas of private rentals. And at the same time, the benefits generated in the private sector are reinvested in the social sector and in the promotion of social housing, and it's used by these entities, these non-profit entities. So this started in the Netherlands because of the Industrial Revolution, etc., because of the growth of the cities, and I don't know why, well, through the legislation, they become more and more strong. And eventually the management will shift the management of these public social housing to these non-profit organizations, these housing associations. Here we see the comparison between this model and the Spanish model. We see a great disparity in social rental housing and owned properties, owned homes, like is the priority in Spain. And also we see the prices. These prices are more balanced in the Netherlands than in Spain, because we have a private rental stock that is lower than the social stock, and this needs to be balanced in order to become more competitive somehow. So with regards to the stakeholders, these are some schemes. I'm going to tell you a little bit which are the stakeholders of each of the models and how they interrelate with each other. I'm not going to dwell into this one because this is the private development model. We don't really talk here about social housing, and I move it directly onto this other model where we talk about precisely that, how social housing is promoted in our country and who are the stakeholders and how they interrelate with each other. So here we have an autonomous government who is generally in charge of these type of operations to promote, to develop social housing, normally through public developers and also private developers. They can develop social housing normally offered for sale. We also have a key role in the financial entities who fund these developments, and also at the same time all that social housing that is offered for sale, which is the main case in Spain, is therefore for those entities to offer access to credit to those citizens who are the ones that ultimately are going to be the ones that are going to access the subsidized housing options. Somehow I also wanted that general scheme to reflect also the problems associated to this scheme during the years of financial crisis as of 2008, and how the lack of funding has made it very difficult for public developers and private developers to develop social housing. And at the same time, the citizens have not had access to credit. Therefore, they have not been able to access, and we've not been able to develop social housing to the citizens. And as a result of that, other entities have emerged. They existed, but they become more protagonists. I'm talking about non-profit entities, the Provivienda, Habitat 3 Foundation. Carmen Trilla will tell us about it later. The La Caixa, Obra Social, Caritas, they have become the protagonists in order to provide support to citizens that were completely unsupported when this scheme stopped working, precisely and simply because of the lack of funding. In the Dutch model, we have a national government that somehow regulates and controls the financial entities so that the social operations have a set of fiscal benefits, low interest rates, etc., etc. The municipal government, who is actually in charge of negotiating the operations taking place in each of the cities with the housing associations, and the housing associations play a key role when it comes to negotiating with all these agents, but they are at the same time the ones that provide social housing to the citizens. And we will talk about it now. They also take care of the management and they engage with the citizens in that role. In this table, I want to summarize everything that I am saying. I don't really want to delve into it very much because I don't think I have much time, but simply I would like to say that, you know, the housing associations are the stakeholders providing housing in the Netherlands. They have a national legislation that regulates them, protects them, and controls them. They have a funding model that is specifically linked to that legislation and enables access to credit and the operations, and is so because of a social approach. And something also very important, which is the engagement. Precisely because the management of all this stock becomes very, very complex for these entities and also for the administrations that transfer the responsibility to these associations because they cannot take care of it. So the way these associations enable the management and the retrofitting and all these things associated to social housing stocks. And they engage the citizens, they engage tenants, and they take part of all those tasks in exchange of accessing housing, reducing the costs, etc., etc. I'm going to go very briefly through the most relevant cases that I visited at the time directly there, and they are also linked to a time of financial crisis where the housing associations didn't have an enormous capacity of for funding, but with the contribution of the tenants, a lot of operations could actually take place. This was an example in Amsterdam. This was a difficult neighborhood, if you want, and the housing association, the IMERE, what it did at the time, it allowed people to come and live here, and those people were artists and students, and they were in charge of repairing, painting, fixing all these area in exchange of a free rental for the first year and very affordable prices from then onwards. In the case of Soho in Rotterdam, I'm not going to tell you details about it, but the same idea was some areas and buildings were provided to youngsters so that they could have access to affordable housing in exchange for their engagement. And all that was done through the housing associations. There are other examples of self-management that take care into the participatory process of designing the building. This is a building that was designed in the 70s. I visited at the time, and a lot of the tenants, one of them who was the architect that I talked to, was still living there. He was renting, but they had actually designed this building, and the housing associations had contributed in the help that they needed. So there are loads of examples of these type of experiences. And I move directly to the concluded remarks. And basically it is that in Spain, as we've already said, we have a very small social housing stock. It is particularly linked to funding needs, and it generates a lot of management issues and maintenance, etc., etc. And as a result of that, the model is not very attractive to the administration. In contrast, we have the Netherlands and Dutch model. We have these entities, the housing associations, who take on this role to provide, manage, etc., because they work directly with the tenants, with the residents, and they engage them so that somehow their work, their involvement is rewarded. So the approach is basically that idea, to have collaborative models between the private sector, the public sector, and the non-profit entities, which have to become protagonists in this kind of model, so that we can reach alternative management models of social housing with a non-profit approach, with innovative solutions. Obviously, this is something complex, and it requires everybody's support, the support of all the stakeholders that I mentioned before. But at the same time, it requires the participation of the citizens, the people living in those developments, so that somehow we create a co-management model where it becomes simpler for these developments to be viable. And I conclude, I'm going to go very quickly through this, because here I tell you a little bit what would be the role that every stakeholder should take. But I think it's better to end by seeing it in the graph, in this scheme. If I start with the last scheme that I showed you for the Spanish model, what do we do? Well, the third sector, the non-profit entities, have to start taking a key role. They have to be to state themselves at the core, and they have to be mediators between the citizens, who are the ones that at the end of the day require that affordable housing, and the administrative entities that are at the top, and at the same time the financial activities and the developers, public and private, who to some extent they need to start incorporating these social entities into their work scheme, so that a social housing stock in our country for rent becomes more and more viable. This is a little bit what I say here, the need of concentration amongst the different stakeholders, collaboration, so that we take the housing onto the market, so that we can offer affordable housing to everyone. And I conclude with this, and I hope I stick to time. Thank you very much for everything. It's been very good, Francisco. Thank you very much for presenting the content in such a clear way and so graphically. We're going to ask you to stay to the Q&A session after the next presentation. I'm going to take this opportunity to remind everyone that after this presentation, we'll have that brief Q&A session and discussion where we'll address the questions that you've sent us and the conclusions. In fact, we have a question in the Q&A session where someone says, Javier Oliver says, could we illustrate with experiences in Europe where there is affordable housing and what solutions have been used in order to reach that affordable housing situation? During the first presentation, we have already seen different strategies and policies for the provision of affordable housing, and we will include it in the file and dossier that we will publish next week. And Javier, also in the chat, we have the link to the 50 solutions document in Spanish. So I hope this is good for you and this answers your question, but otherwise after we publish the dossier, we hope your question is answered. We encourage everyone to post these kind of questions. So as soon as you post them, we will compile them, and at the end of the third presentation, we will start the Q&A session. Thank you very much. And now we're going to move on to the final presentation. We have with us Carme Trilla, President of the Metropolitan Observatory of Housing and President of Fundació Habitat 3, and she will highlight an initiative that Habitat 3 has implemented in Barcelona from a very regional perspective. Bon dia, Carme, how are you?
Hello, good morning, and thank you very much for having invited me to participate in this very intense and interesting work session. Thank you so much for being here with us. We'd like you to tell our audience that the learnings you've had with Habitat 3 for the housing association model, and seeing whether it is a replicable model and scalable model. So you have the floor. Well, I will start presenting my slides to focus my presentation on the topic. I don't know if you can see my screen. We cannot see your screen. No, we can't. I cannot hear you now. No, we can't see the presentation. Okay, now we have it on the screen. It was a PDF format and we couldn't see it well. Well, anyway, first of all, I would like to say that what we just heard from Clotilde, as well as from other Spanish speakers, it's clear that when countries come back from our trips or other trips, we're starting with the trip. So social housing in Spain, understood as a rental social housing at below the market prices, is something very new, a very recent advance, and it's nearly it's nearly 21st century advance, 2006, 2007, because on the 20th century, social housing was not something that we had. We had protected housing, as Francisco Fernandez just mentioned. So this is what really explains that in our country, the housing associations figures that are totally connected to rental social housing are totally inexistent, and Provivienda or Habitat 3 and a few others are in this new path on how to collaborate from a non-profit sector in the public sector to act and react on a field that was highly deficitary. The living or the housing sector in Spain has many deficits. The right to affordable and fair housing is something that was already mentioned. And beyond the structural difficulties, we've also had the difficulties some families had when not being able to face payments and evictions, something that hasn't occurred in other countries before. We could see a graph, which actually I like to reproduce here, which is different evolution of rentals of families and the prices of housing here in the city of Barcelona. The line below is available housing, and the lines above are the prices of housing, or on black, or the rest, or the darkest is a rental pricing. Here we can see how after the 21st century, after and during the real estate bubble before the year 2000 up to 2007, there's a new gap of differential growth between the income of families and prices of housing. That gap is reduced during the time of a crisis, but it's now open after the year 2016, 2017. It will be even bigger in the future. Here is where we have our problem in Spain. That is how this discrepancy takes place, the capacity or ability or inability to pay for rental prices, because most of these prices are real market prices, and non-profit organizations in this sector is practically inexistent. This is why this overburden in the rental prices exists. This is a comparison between the European average. 28% of families that are in the situation overburden, over 40% of their income is addressed to the payment of rent. This is an alarming figure in Europe, but in Spain, we are at the 43% level. 43% of the families that are tenants devote over 43% of their income to pay for the rent. This is a red flag. This is a difficulty in payment and the possible eviction. So if there's a minimum imbalance in the income of these families, the problem would be even greater. Well, we can see the very low presence of public stock in Spain. This is 1.5% rental. Obviously, we're speaking about rental as compared to other realities, as we could see before in other countries such as the Netherlands. Also, this lack of public housing and this lack of affordable rental housing places us at the bottom of the European list. The public budget housing politics or policies in the case of Catalonia is very similar to the Spanish average, and in Spain, in Europe is 0.6% of the GDP. In Spain is 0.1% of GDP. This difference is extremely important when having support schemes for families to face these payments. This means problems. For example, youth emancipation is a problem. We are one of the lowest rates in Europe of youth emancipation. I was asked to explain the idea of Habitat 3, which was born as a body supported by the tertiary sector of Catalonia in the year 2014, 2015, to offer a collective or group answer to the needs existing between different groups of people in a very vulnerable situations. And I would like to underscore this. Within this concept of social rental that we were talking about in Europe, we would be placed in the lowest level, as we heard in the first presentation of the DP Foundation in France. Groups of people not for average or low income with a need of affordable housing. We are dealing with the most vulnerable groups of society. This is the area where we are dealing with as a Habitat 3, the most social area within the social areas. We are participated by a group of companies and federations in the social sector, and we respond to the same philosophy as in other countries in Europe, as we could hear, Netherlands, Denmark, or the UK, or as in France, bailleurs sociaux, or the SLM, or the cooperatives in Austria. But as we could see in these countries, there is a history of actions, and now we are just in the process of being born. Habitat 3 is a tool for the management of social housing in the rental market, to place in the hands of projects of social inclusion. Here we have some other elements to consider. We are not thinking about offering housing to the final users. Rather, we are working as instruments of collaboration, of joint work, either with groups of the third sector, public administrations, and it's them that will determine the final or ultimate users of this housing. We don't have a selection criteria nor a record of requestants, but rather we work through these two big spheres, economic spheres. Our goals are looking for and finding homes at a low price. Little by little, we are achieving this in order to offer a home to the most vulnerable people in our country. And one of the key elements of our model that is shared by some other social organizations in Europe is to accompany, to coach socially coach the residents, because they are the most vulnerable people. Sometimes at a moment of social reinsertion, they need homes and social coaching, and we need to accompany them. So we have this housing first philosophy, because housing is crucial, but it's not the only thing. We need some complementary work that we can do directly through Habitat 3 or in collaboration with other social bodies. People that are with us have lost their homes, that they're clearly in the homelessness sector, and they are particularly vulnerable. In these few years we've been working, I reckon we've had very important success. We went from, well, in the year 2014, we didn't even exist. In the year 2015, we were growing, and we are reaching now 1,000 homes. Some of them have been offered to us through the public administration. Others, it's private owners. This is the most important line of action. Others are the requests of public administrations, and others are requested by social follow-up agencies. And 3 years ago, we began buying some homes that then now belong to us. And out of these homes, fundamentally, as you can see in the graph, are used for municipal programs. These are the gray lines, and the other component is devoted to social bodies. Our challenge is that this part grows little by little in order to be more useful for the tertiary sector and social sector. We are distributed all over Catalonia, and as I said before, the achievement of this housing are offered by private owners who rent these homes to them below market price, and we normally do some refurbishing work because they're in poor condition, and helping other people that are in need of work. And we offer or receive some of the apartments and homes from the Generalitat of Catalonia, the government of Catalonia, and return some buildings that are in poor state into livable homes, and we promote buildings that are newly built, and we use some of the European funds to turn these into realities for the people in need. Well, we have agreements, temporary agreements with the government of Catalonia. We're working with this, and we manage this partially through Habitat 3. The government of Catalonia decided to offer 250 homes, and for the purchase of homes in Catalonia, we have a double line of actions that allows bodies like ours to do some purchase work that allows us to being qualified as social promoters, and this gives us a preferential right to purchase homes that are sold by financial institutions that come from prior evictions. We have a preferential right, but since we do not have funding, well, there is a funding framework supported by the Catalan Institute of Finance, which is a similar organization similar to ICO in Spain, to create a funding scheme for the purchase of social housing. Also, we have the right to preferential right to purchase. We were able to buy 150 homes in the last few years, and we are continuing in this line of action. This is very important because, well, this means that we have the support of the government of Catalonia, the Generalitat de Catalunya, and they are covering the possible differences in the compensation rate between what we are being paid by the tenants and what we need to pay in our mortgage loans. All these differences covered by the government of Catalonia, and these homes, after 75 years, will be in the hands and ownership of the government of Catalonia. But they have been refurbished and managed by us. In the meantime, with the social bodies that we have. Another way of action is refurbishing of unused buildings. Here we have the old residence of Casa Bloc. This is a public donation that we turned into 18 social rental homes. One part that has been offered to Habitat 3, and the rest has been given to other social bodies where we have people that, well, these people had in their records. Another way of working is the new promotion of new homes. We're starting to work with projects that include municipal projects. We have an agreement with the City Council of Barcelona with cooperative actions in order to promote and develop homes in areas that have the preferential right. And we are also working with private developers and financial institutions so that we don't need to ask for a mortgage loan, and we can manage and develop the set of package of actions. We work, as I said, with city councils. But for us, it is very important to work with the institutions of the third sector. Some studies that we performed in the year 2001, we could see that there is sometimes a need of homes, social homes, for these people that they are working with. We're speaking about 1,400 homes in Catalonia for social institutions. We are looking for homes for this end. And in order to cut the long story short, the program of connection with social bodies, program that led us to receive some World Habitat UN awards, given the Gold Award of the World Habitat Awards in 2019 to the best innovative initiative of housing in the world. We have a close relation with this type of organizations that is not so known by the public sectors or the society. In the case with public administrations, I already mentioned that we are working intensely. Unfortunately, the sound quality is very, very poor. Fundamentally, we are speaking about the people who lost their homes because they were evicted from their own. These are the city councils that we signed agreements with, and we continue working with them. One of the main programs we have with the city councils is empty homes program that we are working with private owners looking for these type of dwellings to devote the apartments to refurbish and use to people with risk of social exclusion. We are dealing with 350 homes. This success is fantastic because in 80% of the contracts that are about to finish, there is a renewal. So this means that this is one of the best programs with respect to covering the most urgent needs. other aspects that allow us to work with these type of homes with the close proximity with the users is working and fighting against fuel and energy poverty. We try to approach energy efficiency. And lately, well, due to a COVID crisis, we try to fight against the digital gap that thanks to the social workers we have that are in touch with families, and we're dealing with that with great success. And I will stop here, otherwise I will use more time than I needed. So I will be totally available for your questions. Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much, Karma, for your intervention.
Well, now we're going to start a Q&A session. I'd like to remind everybody that you have in the Q&A icon, you have the opportunity to publish the questions that you may want to raise to the people that have taken part in this session. But I'd like to also highlight before that the dossier will be available in the coming weeks, and we will send it to all the people that have registered in this webinar. And I also like to highlight that in this week of the International Women's Day and this webinar and discussion, we celebrate the majority of women, which is not common in the real estate world, if you want, or the affordable housing world. So before giving the floor to the questions that I start reading in the Q&A box, I'd like to ask you for that, after everything that we've seen throughout these three presentations and Gemma's opening remarks and all the experiences, so as a headline, what would be the key elements to promote the provision of affordable housing in Spain from a non-profit approach? And a headline. If you want, we continue with, we follow the order of intervention. So the question would be, what would be the key elements to promote the provision of affordable housing in Spain from a non-profit approach? You can follow the order of intervention, or you can just go ahead and express yourselves. Well, if I may, I start. Thank you very much, Carmen. Go ahead. Well, obviously, the way this has been addressed in Spain, and in order to take a step forward in Spain in this field, is so we need an important expenditure on public housing in Spain. We cannot do public housing policies with the low GDP rates that we have experienced in the recent years. This is historical, but since the crisis, the drop has been incredible. So the Next Generation Fund's arrival for retrofitting of buildings and for new developers and for buy-in and retrofitting, this is a great opportunity. This is one element, this is one ingredient, but the operations of affordable housing or social housing are in deficit. They're in deficit by definition, because the payment that the users can make, the users of the housing, never covers the costs of retrofitting or the construction costs. So we need that necessary complement of public subsidies that exist in all the countries, and it is recognized here, but it needs to be enhanced in a realistic manner. Therefore, public subsidies to cover the deficits associated to construction and funding costs and the management costs as well. And then we also need funding, not just public funding, we need funding in general. This is a country that is quite reluctant to subsidize rental operations, even more so if this is social renting, as we have an issue here. And thirdly, obviously, we need raw material, which is the land or the existing buildings, existing properties. So we need to mobilize, as is already being said, Francisco Fernandez said it, we need to enhance that direct relationship between the city councils and the municipal lands, or the lands for subsidized housing. All this needs to be reactivated. We need to definitely focus on this. We need to facilitate the administrative proceedings for those lands, or for the retrofitting of these buildings. Also reconsider lands that are not for housing, but for other facilities and turn them into housing. So this is it. Solutions for the deficit, funding in order to facilitate the operations that don't have a return before 30 years, and the raw material, which is the land for buildings or the already existing buildings. Thank you very much, Karma, for your answer. Clotilde, you have the floor.
El micrófono, por favor.
Can you hear me?
Sí, perfecto, gracias.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So first, of course, yes, public funding, but some remarks. So we saw the examples of the Netherlands from Francisco, and it's very interesting, but I just want to point out that homelessness in the Netherlands has doubled for the last 10 years. So public funding and public social housing is not everything. And at Jansa, we like to highlight the example of Finland that you know, of course, and where there was ambitious public funding, but also ambitious political will to target the most vulnerable. So, so that's my first remark. It's not only about public funding, but also about targeting those who need housing most. But of course, the money has to come from somewhere, and it cannot, I think, it can't be only public funding. The role of civil society is also to leverage some private investment for social purposes, as I tried to highlight in some of the examples. I think there is a role for private non-for-profits to also build coalition and advocate, as in the model of Home for All, to underline as well the return on investment in providing housing and quality housing, for instance, in terms of health saving in the future. So yes, public investment, but it's not everything. Also political ambition and leveraging private investment, I would say. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Clotilde.
Thank you very much, Clotilde. Francisco, I don't know if you want to add something? Yes, well, I totally agree with Carmen's opinion and Clotilde's opinion. And in fact, I would add something else that I think it could even be implicit in the approach that they've presented. I think we need public funding, but we also need political will in order for these operations to be implemented. I think in many occasions, we base our expectations in these operations to work, and Karma definitely has a lot more data associated to this because she's obviously working on this. We obviously need funding, but I think we also need a will. Often when we've talked about subsidized housing promoted in Spain, for the housing offered for sale is also publicly funded. And in most cases, when it gets sold, we're not recovering the investment. However, with the housing stock that moves on to private hands, it is no longer rated and it becomes social housing. So as well as funding, we need political will. We need the money, but we also need the will for that money to be used for this goal. And at the same time, I think it needs to, how would I say, we should remove the stigma associated to social housing in our country, particularly rental social housing. At the end of the day, I think that these type of operations have a lot of stigma by the administrations, but also by the tenants, because they see that stock, since we are associated to a minority stock that to which only the most vulnerable population accesses. We want to avoid those type of solutions as a rule, but I think it should be completely the opposite. I think we should remove that stigma so that somehow that becomes stock to which other population layers can access, so that the model becomes sustainable as well. Of course, there will be payment issues with the most vulnerable population, but if the stock is larger and there is another type of population that will be able to face payments and other issues, very surely the sustainability of those type of operations will increase. And now I open up another question for the three members of the panel. What would you think would be the necessary mechanisms and strategies to promote the housing associations model in Spain? If you want, we follow the same order. Clotilde, you can start.
So what would be the strategy to promote housing association model? Well, I guess the key is to show where it works. So I'm sorry if I go back to Finland, and what struck me in the Finnish example is that the political will survive the change in government, and I think that is really important. So it was investment not over 2 or 3 years, but I think it was 15 years investment, continuous investment, and political strategy to invest into housing for most vulnerable group. So I guess that would be one of the key. And one of the question in the Q&A was also on the government dealing with the banks housing, the bad banks housing. And I think there is a key here that's a very good idea and strategy to advocate for this to be made available as a source for affordable housing. And then last thing is cross-sectoral partnership. I really highlight again this Denmark example where 19 organizations from across the sector work together. So public actor, municipalities, foundation, non-for-profit. And I think that's the key to mobilize across the traditional spectrum. Thank you.
Gracias, Clotilde. Francisco.
Thank you very much, Clotilde. Francisco, now you have the floor. Well, I think that as we are already seeing in our country, there are already initiatives towards this model from the NGOs, the social sector, and what we definitely need is a legal framework so that these entities that are already working on these type of models can really have the support to undertake this type of operations and act as key stakeholders in the provision of social housing, whether that is in the promotion of the new developments or the management of existing housing. So I think that legal framework is absolutely fundamental. And at the same time, when we talk about funding, I think we need funding, but we also need to financially protect these type of operations. I mean, we're always talking about the need of funding, but also the conditions of that funding, and also about who's going to fund this type of operations. Perhaps we can start talking about new operators, ethical banking, I don't know. But the idea is that somehow the funding becomes protected for these type of social operations and these type of operations in general, and so that they are not subject to the market like they are for a private development. Thank you very much. Karma, do you want to add something? Well, yes, well, for me, when I say that we need funding, for me, this is obviously totally linked to the political will, that is clear. And we talk about public funding and private funding. I mean, in both cases, political will. I totally agree with Francisco in this regard. So with regards to legislation and the recognition of these emerging figures in Spain, I mentioned before, and I want to insist on that, the Act of 2018 in Catalonia, the Housing Act, we included the social developer role, and that should exist in the whole Spain, the recognition of the social developer. And it's not just to give him the medal, it's because that gives him right to certain preferences within the funding systems or the public land allocation systems. So that a special consideration of the social developer should be claimed, for example, in the new Housing Act at a state level. We can talk to the city councils in Barcelona, in Catalonia, and that allows us to address certain objectives. So what I want to say also is that in the current housing plans, we're already introducing the concept of the non-profit operators as a concept, so that when they receive subsidies, they have they're treated differently to the rest of the developers. So somehow this is recognized. So if you agree at a Spain level, I think we need to clarify the difference between social housing for rental and affordable from the social housing that is very social. When I talked before, I was talking about the very social housing, but the affordable housing, this is the big gap, the big hole that we have today, that in the 20th century was filled by the subsidized housing system for sale, but this has been dequalified, so we need to start from scratch again. So that affordable housing stock that should be promoted and facilitated should not just be associated to non-profit associations. This could be managed by private operators with a limited profit oriented approach, and that way it could all work better. The idea is, they could be for rental if it is profitable, if it is subsidized, at least, so that the private offer can be shifted to a protected offer. And that would allow us to work in the two fields, the most social field and the average, the medium layers, if you want, because otherwise in the most social field, we feel trapped in poverty. Because when our users can improve their situation, they cannot leave the most social stock because they cannot jump onto the market housing. So we need that middle offer where not only entities like us should work on, but also other operators that, according to the criteria imposed by the state, could produce this housing that we so much need. Thank you very much, Karma, and I stay with you because we are now going to address the questions from the audience, and there are some that are addressed to you. Daniel Fabregas asks, is any part of the buy and investment recovered after 75 years when they become public property? Well, when that's the case, we work with 30-year loans, and between 30 and 75 years, we provide a maintenance management of this housing, of these dwellings, and in some agreements with certain city councils, when we cancel the loan, when it matures, throughout it, we will be supporting the evolution of the loan, and then we will pay a fee to the city council for the provision of these dwellings until they become part of the public sector. There's another question for you, Karma. You'll be very successful. Is it possible to have an impact on the over effort of the households on the rent through policies focusing on affordable housing stock, bearing in mind the weight of the market in the price of housing? This is a question by Luisa Pinto Rodriguez. Well, this is key. We have rental housing stock. When we say that 1.5% of the total dwellings are of social rental housing, but if we look at the rental housing, social housing is very little. So the fact that our rental housing is private leads us to very unbearable market prices, like we've said. So we've managed to increase the public or social stock that we're talking about, that will logically be translated into a compensation of the prices, a certain level of regulation of the market, bearing in mind as a result of a lower offer. This is definitely so, but that's not going to take place in the short term. These are medium and long-term policies. So in the short term, the improvement of the situations of the over effort of the different families, the solutions are subsidies to pay the rent. This is what already exists in all the Europe. These are the allowances to pay for the rent. This has been developed since 2004, and that plays a preventive role to prevent evictions from this allowance to the tenants so that they can pay the price of their rent, obviously limiting the cost and limiting the cost of the user. Those are the goals. The third goal would be one that we are demanding constantly, and this is the consultation, the agreements between the public and the private sector to control prices. The agreement of prices in exchange of providing certain tax benefits for the owners in exchange of a supermarket prices, or at least prices below certain indexes, so that all that private stock cools down a little bit and becomes having more variable values, for values that families can bear better. Thank you, Karma. I'd like to remind everyone that we have about 15 minutes of discussion. You can continue sending questions to the Q&A box, and those questions that we may not be able to answer, we'll ask the speakers to reply to them, and we will include them in the dossier. Francisco, this question is for you from Israel Garcia Calderon Pavon. He says, now that the state has had to take on all the properties of the Sareb, what conditions do we need for the housing associations, the non-profit housing associations, to be able to take on part of this stock in order to provide affordable social housing? Well, I think it's a very good question, because on top of everything, it would be very interesting for that housing stock coming from banks and financial entities to start somehow to be part of that affordable or social, however we want to call it, housing. The administrations may not be able to manage them, but social entities could actually manage it. For example, Habitat 3 could manage it, I understand. So the condition should be that the will should be there, the will for that housing stock to be managed by social operators that take on that role. I think it is quite surprising that housing stock like the one coming from the Sareb, it's quite a sense that has not been considered to make it or put it at the disposal of social entities so that they can manage it as affordable housing for all the members of the population that cannot access a market housing. I think it's a matter of will at the end of the day. Thank you very much, Francisco, for your answer. We stick to you because Elena Martinez Goitre has raised a question for you. He says that she has understood that the housing associations in the Netherlands are also housing developers, not just managers. And the question is, as well as allowances for funding or subsidies for support for funding, are there other types of supports for different types, you know, land transfer, etc.? Well, the model of housing associations, I mentioned it very quickly, and a lot of things have actually been mentioned because they are complex, but they have a national legal framework that somehow supports the functioning of the system. And that model allows them to provide financial support to all the entities so that the operations become sustainable through what you said, funding at low interest rates with some different types of advantages, etc. At the same time, under that national legal framework, the work of the housing associations is very linked to the work of negotiating with local authorities, the city councils. So part of that work includes the negotiation that allows the allocation of certain land for developing social neighborhoods, social housing. And there, these conditions are applied, the conditions of how that land is transferred or sold. And then depending on the will of the different city councils, it may work better or worse. But normally the city councils transfer that land, or they transfer it at a very low price, a very affordable price. That is where we see the negotiation. So we see a relationship between the two sides, national with the relation to the funding, and locally in relation to transferring land and the actual operation for the development of housing in the different locations. Well, thank you very much, Francisco. Elena, I had another question for Carme Trilla. The question is related to with regard to the requirements of the users in Habitat 3. You said that you were focusing on the most vulnerable people. Are there any requirements? Who states those requirements? And what is the period of time, the period of permanence, when this is not a rental agreement or a individual?
I just mentioned we don't have an open door to direct access of users that come to us to request for a home. So Habitat 3 that will determine some acceptance requirements, but we go through municipalities, social services, fundamentally housing, or social bodies. They will determine the criteria. It's up to them to decide, in the case of city councils, if homes are what we are looking for, if they want them for the socially excluded groups or fundamentally people and families who lost their homes. Their level of income is very, very low. And finally, they decide that these homes are for this and that family, and they will determine who will be in the list of homes we supply, and they will determine the amount they can pay. And therefore, what the city council will do is to request us and pay the differential between what the families pay and what we have to pay for the a partner of the home. And so these criteria are determined by city councils. And instead of being a city council, it's for a social body. A social body will decide who will live in that home, how much will he or she pay, but the social body will pay for the cost of the rent we have, either if it's the cost of a loan or a mortgage loan, or the cost that we have to pay to a private owner, in according to the legislation we have in Catalonia with respect to the criteria of social housing determined with some income parameters applied for the users particularly. Thank you, Carme. Next question comes from Maite Arrondo, addressed to any of the three speakers in the framework of the debate with respect to state housing, which today is going to be voted in the Parliament, in the Congress. What do you think about this, supporting this type of models in the legal framework? Well, in line with what I said before, and what I said, I understand that it is absolutely relevant, and it's a very good opportunity we should use, and it would be absolutely necessary to have a legal support for this type of figures. It is national law. So I think this is what we need, but we have to have the possibility of joining efforts and doing something positive about it. Well, as I said before, I think this is a key opportunity to introduce a new comment. This is a new opportunity to introduce a concept of social developer, and what are the preferences this has with respect to other promoters within the law of housing. Because right now we are stuck with a royal decree from which determines that we cannot have any subventions if the allocation of the soil has not been done through a competitive process or a tendering. Then we have to fight against social promoters that have no social interest, and this is pushing us aside from possible quick and flexible agreement with the city councils, because we are or they are these other people are considered to be social developers, and they are not. We are definitely. So we should clarify this new concept. The rights of these should be defended. Otherwise, we'll continuously be fighting or arguing or determining whether we are playing against social and private promoter or private developers. So we had to be vigilant with respect to the content of this law that will not make any reference to this topic. Thank you, Clotilde. Would you like to add anything else, or shall we go to the next question?
I'm afraid I don't know enough about the specific Spanish context.
No te preocupes, está bien. Gracias. Pues vamos a ir con la
Well,
última
let's
pregunta.
go to the last question because we are actually running out of time. Our last question comes from Ruben Mendez. Next questions will be gathered in the dossier, so no question will remain unanswered. Ruben asks, well, what do you think about the use possibility to improve accessibility after the first experiences in Catalonia? Well, this type of use assignment or transfer or cession, it's a cooperative access, so unlike traditional cooperatives, which promoted homes and others bought it. Well, this transfer use transfer will allow the members of the cooperative will be able to live in the cooperative. This was related in Catalonia in the year 2006, 2007, and we've had fundamentally important experiences in other municipalities in Catalonia. It's an alternative formula. It's a different formula because it's not especially a social development, because cooperative partners have to participate, and there's an indebtedness that means that there's a certain amount of money that needs to be returned. But this is one more possibility to have access to housing at prices below the market, but determined by the regulation of protected homes, social homes. It's transfer of use. Thank you very much, Karma, for your answer. Before giving the floor to Gema for the closing and the farewell of this session, I'd like to thank all the participants to this webinar, not only for being here, but also for asking so many interesting questions that I'm sure enriched our session greatly. And all those that have not been answered yet will be gathered in the dossier we will soon send. So with no further ado, Gema Gallardo, you have the floor. Thank you, Arturo. Well, I'd like to thank the three speakers. It's been extremely interesting to listen to all of you. It's so nice to hear your opinions and all your knowledge with respect to the diagnosis and the image that you have expressed, even if you've been quick, but you've given us a very interesting introduction, good snapshot showing different initiatives and alternatives that are feasible and that, of course, are doable and can be carried out in our country. I think that three of you coincided in something which is fundamental and that we have not had in our country. That's why the situation is the way it is. You coincided in the importance of regulations and legislation, the control and intervention, even if this word is not highly appreciated in our government. And obviously, this means a political will and public leadership. It is evident, I think, that we have to start from that point to approach such a complex element. We are at a different framework. Most of you, except for Clotilde, have made a reference to the project that is about to be passed, the law, the possible or future law to the right of housing being debated in the parliament. This means that there's a leadership, there's some kind of a political leadership and public leadership. In this project, we see some of the things that you already mentioned. They accept nonprofit organizations as legitimate stakeholders in the affordable housing process. It accepts some of these bodies as housing supplying bodies. Well, some of these bodies try to clarify a confusion with new definitions like social housing, limited price social housing, affordable incentivized housing. These are some of the proposals that we see in our possible new law, and the housing stock with social housing stock. This is a qualitative and quantitative quantum leap with respect to what we had before. Carmen and Francisco know about it. We shall see what the future brings us. I hope that it's going to be positive. When Carmen talked about the Barcelona experience, I felt very envious, because here we have a problem. In the rest of Spain, we have a problem because the state government, if the state government does not lead this type of initiatives, we will have a difficulty. Competences are in the hands of autonomous regions, and well, this is the model that I'm not questioning. Simply, I'm saying that generates an unbalanced situation between the different instruments that end up being the rights of the citizens. And Carmen, for example, told us about the instruments that are being used in Catalonia that evidently are replicable in other autonomous regions. So Karma talked to us about the decree that regulates social bodies, qualifying them as social promotions. Karma talked to us about the right, which gives a priority to social bodies. And well, there is a preference because well, you were qualified as social promoters. This is a full political will. This is another element that you had. So this is this is the element of funding. Carmen talked about subsidized loans that go beyond score and take rights. This is applicable to protected social housing. Most of the investments in housing policies have been done through the subsidization of the interest rates and loans to have access to protected housing. Some housing plans for second-hand housing at limited price. Well, there was an introduction of a new concept. So it's a financial instrument. It's something that it will incentivize and will help us, because in Catalonia you're doing it through the Catalan Institute of Finance. But you also mentioned another fundamental element, that is the cession or transfer of soil at a limited price. I think that there is a housing plan that includes the use optional of soil that can be used, the use of soil for different types of social buildings or social housing. Well, these are different instruments that you have available that can be replicated, that can be used through a legislation and through this public leadership that is so necessary. You talked about sustainability, all these models, which is fundamental. Not only we not only have to implement it, we have to sustain it in time. I think it's very interesting to hear Francisco what he talked about, the social mix, the mix model, to make these models sustainable. And he made also a reference to new possible financial operators like ethic banking. I think this is fundamental. And private investment. Well, all these are elements that can be presented as different things that can include sustainability. Some of these initiatives, I was listening to you. Some of these initiatives, as Carmen said, about the cession of soil through cooperatives, 75 years limit of time. Some of these initiatives were undertaken and when implemented in Spain, no, they have not been escalated. They were just initiatives, pilot projects, things that we just tell after many years. You know, you say, you remember that project that was initiated with that cooperative, but there has not been any political will. This has not been escalated. I hope we learn from all this and we can approach these new products with the most open with the most open mind to be able to escalate it. This was one of the goals we had in this meeting, and if this can be done in some other countries, as Clotilde said, she mentioned 3 examples, 3 4 very interesting experiences with the elderly, with young people, with homeless people, Well, she mentioned some other examples, like Francisco in the Netherlands or the Generalitat de Catalunya, the government of Catalonia, so close to us. That, well, these are elements that can be replicated in Spain. I'm sure we can. I would simply like to say once again, thank you. Thank you for participating. I'd like to thank Carmen, Clotilde, and Francisco. Thank you to the rest of you. It's been so interesting to listen to you. And I'd like to thank all the people that participated in this event. I hope it was useful. I hope this was good food for thought. And I hope this leads us to develop further collaboration to solve this important problem. Thank you all for your presence here.
Gracias, adiós.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Hasta luego. Adiós.
Bye. Bye-bye.